Welcome to the debate. Today we're diving into something I'm seeing everywhere. This trend of applying highly structured frameworks to our personal lives. The kind of iterative systems that build software or keep teams alive in the wild. People are using terms like sprints and personal MVPs for everything from career changes to emotional healing. And I think this is an incredibly powerful democratization of tools that work.
See, I come at it from a completely different angle. I see this as a really exhausting cultural pressure. It's this need to systematize and optimize everything. What works for code? These rigid roadmaps and build, measure, learn loops. I think they fundamentally misunderstand the messiness and frankly, the emotional depth of being a human. There's a real friction between the clean efficiency of a framework and the slow, non-linear way people actually heal.
So that really sets up our central question, doesn't it? Can the chaos of the human experience be effectively managed, maybe even solved, using these systematic toolkits? Or, as you're suggesting, does this just create an unsustainable, superficial chase for control? I'm going to argue that these tools provide the necessary architecture for real growth.
I'm going to argue that they're often reductive, that they can ignore the deep physiological and psychological stuff going on under the hood and just become another way to feel like you're failing, which leads to burnout, not resilience. Look, I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the build, measure, learn cycle is a real substitute for deep psychological work. It's great for finding product market fit, sure, but reducing profound personal challenges or, a career change that takes years to a neat 2-week sprint just feels like it's ignoring massive layers of complexity. The reality of chronic adversity, what people are now calling complex PTSD, it's not a software bug you can just patch.
That's an interesting way to put it, though I'd frame it differently. I think these frameworks are essential because life is chaotic. They don't promise a quick fix. What they do is provide actionable incremental steps. They're toolkits for dismantling overwhelming ambiguity into pieces you can actually handle. When someone is stuck in paralysis, which is a classic trauma response, defining a personal MVP, a minimum viable product, is a critical first step.
Right.
It forces you to ask, what's the smallest, safest thing I can do right now to test the idea that I can move forward? It's about forcing action over just stagnating.
But that overlooks the physiological reality of it. We're not talking about small hurdles here. We're talking about situations where chronic stress has fundamentally altered a person's identity and their ability to regulate their emotions. If your limbic system is constantly firing and your prefrontal cortex is offline, your ability to rationally pivot is, it's severely compromised. We're living in this velocity vortex, and asking someone to constantly pivot isn't empowering. It's just plain exhausting. Systems work for logistics. I'll give you that. Like, maintaining your core body temperature. The 98.6 degree imperative. That's a system. But they completely fail when they ignore the biological cost of constant self-optimization.
I see the point about the physiological burden. I really do. But let me offer a different take, rooted in that same biology. The concept of neuroplasticity it's remarkable. It tells us the brain isn't fixed. It can and it does rewire itself. But the question is how? It rewires through intentional, iterative practice. And the structure is just the container for that practice. Whether it's a mindfulness system to regulate your attention, or structured breath work to force a shift from fight or flight to rest and digest, these systems provide the roadmap. They turn an overwhelming feeling into a specific, measurable action. It isn't optimization at the cost of the self. It's optimization of the self's ability to regulate.
Okay, let's push on that. Specifically on speed and iteration. You talk about sprints, MVPs, but can true healing, I'm talking about addressing childhood trauma, breaking intergenerational patterns, can that really happen under the pressure of a rapid cycle? Doesn't that focus on speed just lead to what some are calling agility fatigue? You get this superficial emotional release, it feels like a breakthrough, but you haven't actually done the slow, deep work. You're skimming the surface and pivoting to the next thing before the last one is even settled.
I'm not convinced by that because the point of this speed isn't about immediate completion. It's about validated learning. It's about risk mitigation. The whole build, measure, learn loop is about generating data points to make your next steps smarter and safer. It's the opposite of that reckless all or nothing approach that leads to burnout. And when you talk about deep trauma, let's look at practices like titration and pendulation.
And for our listeners, what do those terms actually mean in this context?
They're essentially the ultimate microsprint. Titration is deliberately working with the traumatic material in small, manageable doses, only what you can safely process. And pendulation is the structured shifting of your attention between that feeling of activation and a resource, a felt sense of safety or grounding in your body. This incremental, deliberate approach shows that working in these tiny sprints is actually the safest way to discharge that frozen energy without overwhelming the whole system. It's measured, intentional progress. It is a perfect system for managing a biological threat. Now, let's look beyond healing. Let's talk about high-stakes decision-making, crisis management. This is where structured frameworks really prove their worth. I'd argue that mental fortitude systems like the STOP method, stop, think, observe, plan, are the only reliable way to keep your head on straight in a real crisis. Giving yourself a clear context, not control, which means defining your why and your core principles instead of rigid rules, that empowers you to make better decisions faster than just relying on gut instinct.
That's a compelling idea, the whole flexibility thing. But what happens when your resources are gone? That cognitive framework is only useful when you have the bandwidth to use it. In a true high-stakes survival situation, you're fighting hypothermia, some kind of extreme physical threat, you can't just pivot away from reality. The non-negotiable, pragmatic rules take over. You have to follow the strict, hard-won rules of that 98.6-degree imperative. You can't negotiate with physics. You have to know that your shelter needs to block wind and insulate you from the ground. No amount of optimistic reframing matters when you need to know the specific, fatal danger of wearing wet cotton. That situation demands practical, rigid knowledge, an operational checklist. The cognitive system is useful only until the moment your body's survival instincts take over. And that brings me to a major flaw I see in so many of these personal frameworks. They are just too intellectual, too top-down. They seem to completely neglect the foundational truth that the body keeps the score, that it stores unresolved events as physiological reality, not just as memories. So how can a cognitive reframe, or setting a perfect SMART goal, which is all prefrontal cortex stuff, how can that address the persistent tension, the hypervigilance, the chronic pain that comes from the body holding on to the past? You can't just optimize a trauma response away with a to-do list.
I absolutely agree on the somatic reality. That bottom-up processing is vital. But I maintain that a good structured system includes the body. It doesn't ignore it. In fact, applying structure allows us to measure and influence the body more effectively. We can incorporate deliberate practices like interoception and proprioception.
Explain interoception as a system tool.
Interoception is just the systematic observation of your internal state, your heart rate, the tension in your jaw, that feeling in your gut. That becomes the measure step in your cycle. It's the data input for your personal operating system. So once you measure the tension, the system dictates the next action. A structured, body-centered practice like trauma-informed yoga or a specific breathing pattern, which are designed to directly influence the vagus nerve. By doing this, you are systematically shifting your nervous system from threat to safety. These aren't vague goals. They are quantifiable physiological resets integrated right into your personal architecture. The system forces you to look inward and act on what you find. Ultimately, I think your critique assumes these are supposed to be quick fixes. But I'd maintain that a resilient life is built on a lifelong commitment to evolving. It's a continuous process, and the structured mindset is what makes that sustainable.
By regularly doing self-assessments, retrospectives, if you will, to check for things like that agility fatigue you mentioned, you can proactively prevent burnout. The system helps you manage the system itself. It forces you to set boundaries, to schedule rest, to prioritize self-care. It's the difference between blindly working hard and strategically working sustainably.
But see, that's where the whole thing collapses under its own weight for me. Doesn't that entire process, that mandatory perpetual cycle of self-assessment, of optimization, doesn't that create a new source of stress? This pressure to always be thriving, optimizing, constantly learning and pivoting. It feels like we've just repackaged the emotional exhaustion and depersonalization from corporate burnout and aimed it at ourselves as self-improvement. If I have to constantly review my own progress with the relentless pressure of radical candor, where's the space for unstructured rest, for spontaneity, for just being without the pressure to measure or monetize my own existence? The system demands endless, performative labor, so my core skepticism remains. While structure is useful for logistics, for planning, for achieving external goals, I think true human growth, deep adaptation, it often requires messy, non-linear processes that just resist being quantified.
And we risk confusing the feeling of relentless progress with genuine meaning or, a sense of peace.
Agree that the system requires endless labor. A systematic mindset offers a roadmap for agency. It gives a person the power to stop being a passive victim of chaos. It lets us transform overwhelming circumstances, whether that's a chronic illness or navigating complex family dynamics, into manageable, purposeful challenges. The systematic approach provides the critical architecture you need to build a resilient life. One iteration, one mindful pause, one successful incremental step at a time.
And I suppose that's where the debate rests. Navigating change, whether you choose the path of measured steps or accepting the non-linear mess of it all, it requires profound intention and, I think, a lot of courage.
I agree. The choice really is for each person to decide how much structure they need to balance the inevitable chaos of life with their own desire for purposeful action.